Hi, I'm Samuel C. Spitali, author of How to Win the War on Truth. In this video, we'll look at the truth about the Trump presidency. As Donald Trump runs for a second term, it's important to revisit his presidential record and remember his administration's most notable milestones, starting with his economic performance. Despite promising to bring back manufacturing jobs, the U.S. lost 154,000 factory jobs during Trump's tenure, and the share of private sector employees working in manufacturing fell below 10% for the first time since the government started tracking the data in 1939. In fact, Trump had the worst jobs record of any president on record, with more than 3 million jobs lost. Even prior to the pandemic, job growth under Trump ran about 3%, less than under Barack Obama. Joe Biden's presidency saw an increase of 6 million jobs, and the economy is nearly 10% larger under Biden than at Trump's pre-pandemic peak. Before COVID, average incomes had fallen under Trump by over $1,000 per household. For those earning less than $250,000 a year, their income was greater in 2016 during Obama's last year in office than in 2019 under Trump. Under Biden, wage gains have finally exceeded that of inflation, due in large part to the administration's pro-labor policies. The Trump administration, however, pursued policies that only benefited the wealthy and corporations, like the massive Trump tax cuts, which rolled back the taxes of billionaires to the 1910s so that they paid less than school teachers, factory workers, and retirees. Trump also reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And he forgave a significant portion of unpaid taxes that multinationals had been hiding in tax shelters since the 1980s. As a result, the tax burden to fund the government shifted from companies to the working class, who are now responsible for 86% of federal revenue. This giveaway to the wealthiest Americans added $2.3 trillion to the national debt, creating more debt than any non-wartime president in U.S. history. Trump's tax cuts cost the U.S. government more than Biden's infrastructure bill, Inflation Reduction Act, American Rescue Plan, CHIPS, PACT, student debt forgiveness, and funding the IRS combined. Despite claiming to drain the swamp, Trump appointed the most unqualified cabinet in U.S. history, with cronies intent on dismantling the very agencies they were tasked to run. In all, some 45 individuals from the Trump administration, campaign, and organization have been criminally indicted, racking up a staggering 335 criminal charges so far. Trump advisor Roger Stone was convicted on 7 counts of lying to Congress, obstruction, and witness tampering. Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort pleaded guilty to violating lobbying laws and witness tampering. National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, and campaign aide George Papadopoulos pleaded guilty to lying to authorities. Trump campaign deputy chair Rick Gates pleaded guilty to conspiracy. Trump CFO Alan Weiselberg was found guilty of tax fraud and perjury. Trump election lawyer Sidney Powell, Kenneth Chesebro, and Jenna Ellis pleaded guilty to interfering in the 2020 election. And there's the January 6 insurrectionists. Over 1,230 Trump supporters have been charged, 730 pleaded guilty, and 170 have been convicted so far. And there's Trump himself, now a convicted felon. He faces 88 criminal charges since leaving office and has been found guilty of 34 for paying hush money to a porn star to influence the 2016 election. He was fined $355 million for fraud in a civil suit and prohibited from serving as an officer or director of any New York corporation for 3 years. He was fined over $88 million in 2 defamation cases against a former model he was found guilty of raping. He had to pay $25 million to defrauded students for the now-defunct Trump University. And he was ordered to pay $2 million in damages to 8 different charities for misusing charitable funds. And he had to shut down the Trump Foundation for misconduct. But Trump's lawsuits didn't start with politics. He racked up more than 4,000 lawsuits before even taking office. Trump is the first American president to face a criminal trial, a federal indictment for retaining and concealing classified documents, and a state or federal indictment for trying to overturn an election. He's the only president to be impeached twice, and the first to be impeached on national security grounds, even though he's committed a multitude of impeachable offenses, including, but not limited to, violating the Emoluments Clause, obstruction of justice, ordering unconstitutional imprisonment of migrant families, abusing the pardon power, high crimes and misdemeanors, conspiracy against the U.S., and conspiracy to illegally influence the 2016 election. Trump leaked classified intelligence to Kremlin agents in the Oval Office in May 2017, and he refused to hand over the more than 300 classified documents he kept illegally at Mar-a-Lago, which may be linked to the troubling increase in the arrests and killings of CIA informants in 2021. By comparison, Joe Biden's 4 years as president, 8 years as VP, and 36 years in the Senate have resulted in 0 investigations, indictments, or convictions. Ditto for Barack Obama. And let's not forget the mismanagement of COVID-19, which probably should have been criminal. In 2018, Trump disbanded the National Security Council's Global Health Security and Biodefense Unit that had been created by the Obama administration in preparation for a deadly pandemic. And he ignored the 69-page handbook on how to respond to such a crisis. When Trump was first alerted to the coronavirus outbreak in 2019, he simply chose to ignore it. Once it became unavoidable in 2020, he treated the national health crisis like a public relations crisis, ignoring and refuting the recommendations of health experts and suggesting people should take horse dewormer, which led to a 245% increase in calls to poison control, or drink bleach, which led to a 121% increase in accidental poisonings from household disinfectants. The U.S. had more COVID deaths per capita than any large population, high-income nation, and second only to India. Because of Trump and his lackeys' anti-vaccine rhetoric, some 40% of the deaths occurred after vaccines were available, which means that 180,000 to 235,000 Americans died because they refused COVID-19 vaccinations, the majority of which were in counties that voted overwhelmingly for Trump in 2020. The death rate in these counties was as much as 5 times higher than counties that voted for Biden. In total, over 1.1 million Americans died of COVID, nearly double the number of Americans who died of the Spanish flu in 1918. Trump, however, began harming Americans long before the coronavirus. Beginning in 2015, when he entered politics, psychologists documented an increase in schoolyard bullying caused by Trump's rhetoric. They called it the Trump effect. Soon, the term expanded to include religious and racial bullying by adults, which led to an increase in hate crimes not seen in generations. In cities where Trump held rallies, hate crimes increased by a whopping 226%. White supremacists were so emboldened by his 2016 victory that in the 10 days after the election, there were 867 hate incidents that invoked his name. In the 2 weeks following his inauguration, there were 70 anti-Semitic incidents and 31 anti-Muslim acts. In 2017, the FBI documented 280 hate crimes on college campuses, an increase of nearly 50% in 2 years. In 2019, the U.S. had more anti-Semitic crimes than at any time in the last 40 years. In 2020 and 2021, the U.S. saw more than 8,000 incidents of extremism and anti-Semitism. The number of FBI investigations into white supremacist and anti-government terrorism tripled during Trump's term, to become the #1 terrorist threat in the U.S., even dwarfing the number of ISIS cases. Trump's white nationalist supporters perpetrated attacks on Jewish synagogues, burned mosques, desecrated Jewish cemeteries, engaged in mass shootings of immigrants and African Americans, mailed pipe bombs to Democratic Party leadership, and launched an insurrection on the U.S. Capitol, where in total 9 people died, 140 officers were injured, and property damage totaled $2.73 million. And after Trump rebranded the coronavirus pandemic as the China flu, hate crimes against Asian Americans rose by 150% to nearly 3,800 instances in the first year of the pandemic. But instead of trying to curb the rise in hate, the Trump administration canceled federal domestic terrorism training for both state and local law enforcement in 2017. And they also canceled federal grant funding to organizations that were working on countering violent extremism by white nationalists. Thus, the hate continues. Since 2016, threats against members of Congress have increased tenfold. But perhaps Trump's greatest legacy will be how he reshaped the judiciary. Despite failing to win the popular vote and never being supported by a majority of the population, Trump appointed 3 judges to the Supreme Court groomed by the pro-business, anti-government Federalist Society. As a result, the Supreme Court became more extreme, more partisan, more activists, and more corrupted, defying the Constitution, removing checks and balances, and overturning a half-century's progress and precedent. The court overturned Roe v. Wade, removing a woman's right to abortion, paving the way for restricting access to abortion medication, IVF, birth control, and contraception. Some of the draconian measures enacted at the state level have made it a crime for a 10-year-old rape victim to terminate her pregnancy. In addition to stripping women of bodily autonomy, the ruling opens the door for stripping away other rights like marriage equality, civil protections for same-sex couples, or even interracial marriage. The court also overturned Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, restricting the federal government's ability to regulate pollution and protect the public and the environment. This comes after the court ruled that the Clean Air Act does not allow the EPA to limit carbon emissions from power plants in order to fight climate change, and after Trump rejected Obama-era regulation to reduce exposure to toxic chemicals in the air and in our homes. The court ended over 60 years of affirmative action, eroding civil rights-era legislation aimed at combating racial discrimination. They allowed cities to criminalize homelessness, allowed Trump to discriminate against Muslims, no longer required police to read people their Miranda rights, upheld voter suppression laws, and allowed partisan gerrymandering. But perhaps most detrimental, they gave the president the immunity of a king, absolving him from legal accountability for criminal conduct while in office. Other Trumpian highlights include repealing safeguards to protect people from sexual harassment, rolling back bank regulations designed to prevent another financial crisis, cracking down on legal immigration, making it harder for U.S. businesses to hire highly skilled foreign workers, separating at least 5,000 children from their families at the Mexican border and locking them in cages, of which 2,000 kids have still not been reunited with their parents. Over 50 asylum seekers died in custody, at least 6 of whom were children, and nearly all of which were preventable. Meanwhile, Trump spent nearly a third of his presidency at his golf courses and properties, playing golf 285 times in 4 years and costing taxpayers nearly $500 million, compared to the $96 million President Obama spent in all 8 years in office. Trump was the first president to be found lying publicly more than 30,000 times in 4 years. He was the first president in modern history to refuse to accept the results of an election, the first to attempt to overthrow the government to hold on to power, and the first to incite an armed insurrection on the steps of the nation's capital. The year Trump won the presidency, the U.S. was downgraded from a full democracy to a flawed democracy. After Trump's insurrection in 2021, the U.S. was downgraded again and is no longer the world's oldest continuous democracy, but what's called an anocracy, a form of government somewhere between a democracy and an autocratic state. Trump is such a threat to civilization that the doomsday clock, which alerts the public to the likelihood of man-made human extinction, was moved to 2.5 minutes to midnight during his first year in office, the closest it's been since 1953. None of these facts about Trump, nor the damage he's wrought, is secret. But thanks to partisan media, they are not only dismissed or denied, but replaced with propaganda designed to mislead and manipulate low-information voters who will never bother to check the lies they're fed. The rest of the world, however, has long recognized the threat. As psychiatrist Alan Francis wrote in his 2017 book, Twilight of American Sanity, Trump manages to be truculently wrong on every existential question facing humanity, denying global warming, encouraging pollution, opposing population and gun control, escalating obscene inequality, and trampling on civil rights protections. This will likely be one of the scariest 4 years in U.S. history, right up there with the War of 1812, the Civil War, the 2 World Wars, and the Great Depression. Recognizing Trump's existential threat to democracy, the world now braces as America seems prepared to forget the damage of those 4 dark years and blithely hand him 4 more. To read more, check out some of the many books written about the Trump presidency. And of course, my own book, How to Win the War on Truth. And be sure to like and subscribe. Special thanks to Alan Wincup for the illustrations, and thank you for watching.